we had like a workshop in my house that was just filled with lasers, creating a laser, which as a young child is kind of wild. Interview process at Apple was started at 8 a.m., ended at 5 p.m., and it was just half-hour interviews back to back. Do we have to build boats in New Zealand forever? Absolutely not. We can build boats in the United States, Europe, Asia. A lot of drag from boats has to do with wave creation and surface area, and hydrofoiling, by removing boats from the water and flying on relatively small wings, practically eliminates wave creation.
My experience from being at Vessev, it's like driving a car, but just on water. That's
As if we introduced rubber tires and active suspension to cars. And if you look at like hardware standards for like what we're trying to do, that is peanuts. That's nothing for like putting a world's first product on the water. The reality is, I think the universities de-emphasize electrical engineering quite a lot.
This is Pavlyukovskyy, and welcome to the TechMates podcast, where my partner Hendrik and I explore how Kiwi and Aussie founders are reshaping the future and what sets them apart. Hendrik and I have been part of successful companies in Silicon Valley and Europe, and now bring that expertise to partner with entrepreneurs in Australasia. By sharing the personal stories of successful Kiwi and Aussie founders and how they got here, we hope to inspire you to dream big. This is TechMates, bringing an outsider's perspective to the stories of those daring to disrupt down under. Let's dive in.
Hey, Eric, nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming.
So good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of
awesome.
course.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, no, we want to know all about your journey. So you came from the US to New Zealand on a boat, as far as I understand. So we want to know all about that, your journey at Apple. And then, of course, you're the CEO of Vessev, super exciting company out of New Zealand that we are lucky to be a part of and part of the journey. So yeah, want to learn more about that. But yeah, maybe we start with your background. So you are from the US and you are an engineer by training. Is that correct?
Yep. Originally from Seattle. I get mistaken for a Canadian occasionally, which I'll accept. And I have a citizenship, but technically I'm American.
Can you tell us about your like early kind of background, childhood? What were the big
Yeah.
influences in your life when you were a kid?
Yeah, it's like a little bit of context. So like my dad was, a bit of an influence on me. He actually ran a company called Sinrad Lasers and Laakmann Electro Optics. And we had like a workshop like in my house that was just like filled with like lasers and things that he was doing on there. And like the way they work is actually kind of wild. Like he's basically blasting RF into a chamber filled with CO2 that was causing an intense amount of infrared light to be generated, which was creating a laser, which as a young child is kind of wild.
Wow.
And yeah, I think obviously like I think being exposed to that, ends up being a big influence. And secondly, too, my family were sailors. So we did sort of like a bit of sailing in Mexico and French Polynesia when I was a young kid. And
Yeah.
I think, when you have those like this expression core memories these days, when you have those like really joyous like core memories as a kid, they stick with you as adults. Like your
Mhm.
parents teach you values that you carry with you for the rest of your life in terms of what does a good experience look like. And so I think that exposure to sailing, definitely had me very interested in boating and marine.
Would you kind of go into the workshop with your dad? Would he like teach you about the stuff? Would you tinker with the lasers or what was that like?
Not so much. I ended up working for one of his companies for a little bit in college where I did a lot of burning stuff and sort of vaporizing stuff. But yeah, it was way beyond me when I was a young kid.
Cool.
Your dad was also an entrepreneur.
Yep. Yeah, so he founded Sinrad Lasers. He passed away when I was 8, so I didn't get sort of like as much education there as I would have wanted. But I think, yeah, like even when you're a kid, like your role models end up being your parents, and he was definitely an entrepreneur and definitely in the electrical engineering lane.
Did you want to pursue engineering? Like, were you always curious about engineering, kind of because of those early experiences?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. Like, I don't know that I went to university and ever made any choices about what major I was going to get. I just went to university and decided I was going to major in electrical engineering. Like, I don't know. I must have been one of the rare kids that didn't waffle of like, what path did I choose to take? And yeah, I assume that came from what I was exposed to as a kid. You definitely in high school, the hands-on projects in physics class, as well as a few other sort of science classes were definitely influential in terms of like what tech I wanted to take.
Cool.
And
And
then,
then
then you
what?
landed your dream job at Apple.
Like I had 2 weeks between graduating and like joining Apple in university. Do you guys know what oscilloscopes are? It's like a fundamental tool of electrical engineering for visualizing signals. It's like the measuring tape of like integrated circuits. And I don't know, like when I was in university, I obviously was using them and then was taking a class on FPGAs, which are field programmable gate arrays, programmable silicon. and then realized that I could create my own oscilloscopes on FPGAs, which is a ridiculous thing to go do because like I have like a perfectly functioning oscilloscope available to me. And then I proceeded through two big sort of like development cycles to create my own oscilloscope. Yeah, everything
Hmm.
including monitor, an analog front end, all the digital signal processing that goes on the device itself. So we did one version, which was pretty good, then decided to be a bit more ambitious and created a second version and pulled like a team of other students into this. Yeah, like it ended up being a gigasample oscilloscope with a 100 megahertz front end with a side digital logic analyzer and like a 20 megahertz arbitrary wave generator that like ran an application on a MacBook. Yeah, I didn't know why I was doing it other than like it was fun and it was hard. And I honestly probably spent, a bit of time in classes actually working on this thing.
Uh-huh.
But the cool thing was is that, when someone from Apple came knocking at our university and like asking for the professors, like, oh, who would you like recommend to like chat with us? Because I was doing this weird thing off to the side, that got me
Mm.
noticed by professors who then recommended me to go talk with this person from Apple who was knocking. So I go to my like actual interviews at Apple and I bring my janky oscilloscope, which like electrically great, mechanically awful. Like I took sheet metal, like actual aluminum and just bent it into shape and made like a terrible enclosure.
Uh-huh.
And I definitely think that like that made a difference, like bringing that to the interview and actually having that to discuss
Hmm.
with everyone that came through. Because the interview process at Apple was, it started at 8 a.m., ended at 5 p.m., and it was just half-hour interviews back to back to back to back to back to back to back.
This is an oscilloscope, right? Right here.
Yep. Yeah, yep.
So you created like your own with a screen with a way to like measure
I can send
things.
I can send you the dumbest Vimeo video ever. Like I made a
Oh yeah.
promotional video on the oscilloscope. It's oddly embarrassing, but I can send it to you.
Send it to us.
Um,
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. Well.
it was cool because like in the interview, the head of hardware engineering for iPod like pointed to like bits of my PCB. It was like, what are these traces for? And there were traces where I had to actually lengthen one of the traces and shorten another trace because of the speed of light across the circuit board. Because there's a
Hmm.
differential pair and pairs of signals landed at the gate at the wrong time, you can actually end up with the wrong signal. And yeah, I think it's cool when you can do an interview and direct stuff to what you've done. If you look
Hmm.
at best predictors of success for someone in a new role, yeah, there's only so much you can tease out about like asking about what you do. It's way easier to ask people about what they've done and let them show you their passion and where they actually have subject matter expertise. So it's a good way for me to turn the conversation to what I've done. And,
Yeah.
of course, the mechanical engineering lead gets in there, like lifts up my like awful enclosure and he's like, all right, we're not going to talk about this.
And then so you
Wow.
joined the podcast team at Apple first, and then went to the watch team, correct?
Yeah, so I joined the iPod team.
iPod, sorry, not
Uh,
podcast. Yeah,
yeah, the podcast team at Apple came about after 2012.
right.
Joined the iPod team in 2012, which if you looked at like actual iPod sales in the year 2012, it had already been through peak iPod and it was like on an
Mm.
absolute decline because iPhone was eating its lunch. And so there was actually a huge amount of folks that had left the group, go off and do different things. It was one of like actually the last people left in iPod. So I ended up running projects, going to Foxconn and Pegatron. And I was like 22 or 23, doing executive reporting on like what was going on. And then actually, running roadmap meetings for iPod in terms of like how do we actually create compelling products in this space in the context of iPhone eating our lunch. And so you got exposed to like a bunch of different stuff, like, just out of college at, a company that, arguably does a lot of stuff really well, product management, contract manufacturing, and engineering overall. I think that process of doing that on iPod built me up enough credibility that I was able to jump over to the initial Apple Watch team, which in 2013 was like just kind of brewing. It had a bit of concept within Apple for a long time. There were iPod Nanos with wristbands that were strapped to people's wrists, and people were like really getting a feel for it. And yeah, it was cool to join that project effectively 2 years before it shipped because you get to see the full process, everything from concept, like we don't really know who this is for, what this is supposed to do, what features it's supposed to have, like how do we actually decide what kind of battery life it needs when the silicon hasn't been developed and actually the software applications you don't really know how people are going to use them yet. Taking all that information, going to like concept and agreeing that like, hey, this is the Apple Watch that we are going to go build, and then effectively going through new product development, which for a brand new form factor for Apple that had two different enclosure sizes and had three different housing materials, and was the first time Apple was doing water resistance. Yeah, it's challenging device. And there were like a few other new technologies that got introduced with the original Apple Watch, like the way that the actual main logic board is produced uses the same technology that RF modules are produced with, where it's a ceramic substrate instead of a PCB, then fully pot and then cover with a silver coating. The lead time from soldering your PCB turned from, I think, 10 days on a normal iPod or a normal iPhone to like 6 weeks. So now you wouldn't actually know if the PCB you created worked in the form factor
Wow.
until
Mm.
significantly was true before. And yeah, there's a lot of unique challenges associated with it.
So you were like right out of college, given just a ton of responsibility.
Yeah, which was like awesome. Like I think I have to give a lot of credit, by the way, to a man named Ram Fish. He actually was the one who hired me into Apple and was a alumni from my school that like was the one that sort of like went knocking over there. But I jumped in, he gave me a huge amount of responsibility up front. I think I was at Foxconn within like a week of like joining. I didn't know I was going to be in China like a week, like 2 weeks after graduating, and then like a week after getting into Apple, like I was at Foxconn at their Shenzhen facility on an iPod Nano line.
Wow. And was that, I mean, but like you probably had very little context about what was going on. Was that, looking back, do you think that was useful to do that to like just a fresh grad? And how did
Yeah.
that also maybe, yeah, shape your experiences now when you hire folks?
I mean, like, I think this is true in a lot of aspects of life. But if you want to learn something, full immersion, which goes right hand in hand with making a fool of yourself in some ways, is the best way. Jumping in, not necessarily knowing exactly what the right path is or not necessarily having the experience. But that's what like really teaches you the lessons quite fast.
What was that? So then you went, did the iPod thing kind of just end, or were you promoted at what, or did you
I
want to
think
do that watch team?
I think I sought out the Apple Watch team. I'd done
Mhm.
a iPod Nano project or been part of an iPod Nano project, been part of an iPod Touch project. I'd then done another iPod Touch project, and I think I sought out the Apple Watch project as I understood that it was like forming. Because there's a
Got it.
kind of there's an inflection point with an Apple for like
Yeah.
product development when you go from like R&D to like no, now we're going to ship something. And you go from this like small nucleus of a team to like, okay, we've got to get all of the gears turning on this to actually like get this going. So I joined right at that inflection point where it went from R&D into, hey, we actually want to ship this.
It sounds like you had some varied experience. You first, when an iPod team, you were managing the project. So actually, you were never on any R&D teams. You were always kind of on projects that were shipping.
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about Apple is they take on an incredible amount of risk in product development. And you kind of have to do that. Like when you're trying to introduce new technologies, like going from lab scale, it worked to like we're going to ship millions of these things, like inevitably it's an R&D project. And Apple's great about actually adopting the risk to go do that. There's like a couple different examples of technologies within Apple projects which had to be developed on the fly. Like didn't necessarily work fully at the get-go, but there was enough smoke there where it was like obvious that, hey, this can possibly work as we get through it. There's also examples of technology where, yeah, it didn't actually work. As we went through the production process and prototyping process, it became clear that, hey, there isn't a path within the constraints of physics to actually make this technology work given what we know today.
You were there when Steve Jobs was there?
No, just after. I think he passed away. I don't know the exact year, but it would have been within a reasonably short amount of time.
Got it. What did you learn about the essence of Apple, right? So from the experience you had before you joined the watch team and kind of led that, it sounds like you learned something that got you really excited about doing a new project. What do you think? What was that essence of, that you say makes Apple Apple?
What sets Apple apart is incredibly results driven, like, and you kind of have to be in that land. Apple has the great fortune of, having gone through periods as a company that were quite adverse and, almost effectively dying. And, like those
Like
time periods,
The John Scully years?
yeah,
Yeah.
those time periods would have been like in the 90s. But because Apple had gone through that and then come out of it, part of its culture is no, 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 we have to like be results driven. We have to sort of like do our best work at all times. And that isn't necessarily a part of the culture it might be changing today, but it isn't necessarily part of the culture that exists at some of the other large tech companies because they haven't had as hard of a ride to get to where they've gone. They reached profitability extremely quickly and have never had to have that incredible drive to do hard stuff and do it
Hmm.
well.
Are
Yeah,
these
yeah.
things that you've taken on to Vessev as a CEO now, being incredibly results driven, being always excellent?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the quality of your product and the quality of what you do defines almost everything about your company. There's only so much you can do like outside of like actually having a quality product to determine the fate of your company. Yeah, I mean, yeah, end of the day, I've also happened to work with a bunch of people over here who they themselves are very results driven. So I don't know that I need to sort of like instill that because I think it just exists here.
What was the Apple Watch thing like? I mean, that product, like you said, I still honestly don't understand what the point of it is. Because you got so many screens staring at you in your hand, you got it on your computer, adding another screen that's just like shining into your eye. And I understand people, you told me, that health was the main reason. And so I understand why people, I guess, they use it. But even at the time, right, it was kind of like a big question mark, like you were saying, had to figure out. So did you feel like it was more of like kind of a chicken and egg thing where like you guys didn't know who the user was, you didn't know why you were building it? And it was like, hey, like let's just pigeonhole this technology into this use case, or did you feel like, hey, I actually really feel strongly about the use cases here? Yeah, what was that whole kind
There's
of
three
process like?
there's three sort of like umbrellas of like what the Apple Watch is for. The first one, and I think this one is the least important, is to be the minimum screen that doesn't force you to use your big screen. So you can still be connected to your notifications, but without the social stigma of being checking your phone like this while you're having a conversation. I think that's okay. I actually don't think that's the most important thing because like fundamentally most notifications you can wait for. And then there's like these two other branches over here of like what it's for. One of them is like activity tracking. So like actually gamifying your activity. Humans love sort of like that which is measurable will improve. And so as soon as you start gamifying that in like a really rich way, people start responding to that. There's other third pole that I think is the most interesting thing. Yeah, if you look at like what the number one killers are for people, heart disease is up there. I think it's either number one or number two. Cancer is up there as well. Like little features on the Apple Watch, like, oh, if your heart rate goes above 120 BPM and you're not doing anything for a little bit, it's probably a sign that like maybe something's going on. And giving users that notification to say, hey, your heart's pretty high, not doing anything. Maybe you're watching a scary movie, but like if you're not, maybe you should go get that checked out. Yeah, and it's a small feature, but so if you so like at Apple, you can actually email tcook@apple.com. You and someone will probably read that email. There's a whole team of people that actually reads tcook@apple.com emails. So after we launched the Apple Watch, like, people started emailing in. It's like, Dear Tim, this is a story of how the Apple Watch saved my life. I got this notification. I went and got it checked out with the doctor, and like I found out I had this issue that I might not have caught had I not had the Apple Watch. And if you say that this is happening on a frequent enough basis, I know this is like a tall thing to say, but you can literally probably say that at a certain age, the Apple Watch will legitimately, on the balance of probability, extend your life because you're going to catch things earlier than you otherwise would. And yeah, there's other kinds of like interesting stories there as well. There's like a kiteboarder who had a kite go down and break offshore of Santa Cruz. And this is after we had actually released the cellular version of the Apple Watch. He was able to call the Coast Guard from his wrist because he didn't have his phone on him and actually
Wow.
get picked up. He may not have been picked up otherwise. So like, we talked a lot about like what is the killer app for this product. And like it's funny that for the Apple Watch, the killer app ended up being actually saving lives.
I mean, at the time, there were a lot of other smart watches that were launching on Kickstarter. Pebble was a big one that ultimately I think shut down. There's Jawbone, right? That also kind of like I think petered out. I think there was a big kind of debate before Apple Watch was launched whether Apple would get into the space and wipe out all the competitors, and then eventually it did. So yeah, so what was that whole stint like? Did you enjoy it? What were the big learnings? How did that whole kind of chapter go and finish out in your life?
The role that I was in was like being the engineering program manager. And the cool thing is you get to interface with like essentially every single team in that role. Everything from product management up front, which is effectively marketing, operations, to all of the engineering teams that are supporting, development, as well as like the software teams as well. And through that exposure, you get like breadcrumbs and like bits from everywhere effectively. And I think that experience is super valuable just in terms of seeing all the different ways that things can be done and seeing sort of like the way that Apple happens to do them given its history.
Anything really surprising during that process?
So like the first time I went to Foxconn, like, I had this vision that like a iPod assembly line was like going to be very automated, like lots of robots, clean rooms, like things like that. And it was like just a row of operators, like doing one sort of like step at a time. It was like if you looked at like a technological graph of complexity, it was like one step above knitting, but like nowhere near automated at all. And yeah, I asked a lot of questions of like, well, why isn't this automated? Because it seems like it'd be faster, we'd have fewer quality issues, all that. But it's actually driven by flexibility and speed. Humans are far more adaptable at adapting to change and getting a product out to market. When you introduce all of the automation machines, it slows things down. And by the time I was leaving Apple, a lot of that automation was being introduced. It started with like assembly stations that would take over a single assembly step. That operator would put a unit in, it would go on a tray, some operation would happen and come out the other end. And I'm sure it's advanced a little bit from there. But part of that's been driven by the design requirements for the Apple Watch, which is effectively a piece of jewelry. Yeah, the manufacturing challenges just get tighter and tighter and tighter every year.
Any big learnings around manufacturing overseas? Obviously, it's much cheaper. There's a language barrier. I guess the folks are trained in doing that. But yeah, I mean, any kind of like macro thoughts around you're building something in New Zealand now, which is not historically known as a manufacturing hub, right? What any kind of macro thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like it comes down to like volume and supply chains for what you're doing. Like for Apple, like their supply chain for an iPhone or an Apple Watch like exists in one place in the world. Like it's not actually about like where you assemble it. It's about where all the parts are being made. Just so yeah, like, if you were looking at doing like electronics manufacturing today, there's probably a few more options, but like, they're early in the development cycle compared to where China's at. For us, like our volumes are relatively low and our supply chain, like we're not really tied to anywhere in the world. And, here in New Zealand, you actually have like such rich and deep composite experience, from all the boat building, from the America's Cup, from Rocket Lab. And so there's a lot of good reasons for why if you build in New Zealand in our space, you will deliver a quality product. And the most important thing you can do is deliver a quality product. And, that's what creates the value in your company. Now, in the long arc of things, are we, potentially going to do some manufacturing overseas for some subcomponents? Absolutely. Do we have to build boats in New Zealand forever? Absolutely not. We can build boats in the United States, Europe, Asia. But in terms of getting it right from the get-go, it's not worth the cash savings to like go try to figure out like overseas manufacturing when you just have to deliver a quality product.
What made you want to move on from Apple then? You spent a good seven years there.
When I first moved to San Francisco, like I looked at the prices of rent and I was like, the rent is too damn high.
Fair enough.
And you can get an apartment for $1 million. And I looked at the prices of boats and I could get like a boat I could live on for like 70,000. And then I had a boat. So it was like, obviously that's what I'm gonna do. Like there's no question in my mind of like what the right steps were. And so within a couple months,
Wait, you bought a boat? You were living on a boat?
yeah, I lived on a boat for like all 7 years I lived in San Francisco.
Wait, really?
Yeah, 100%. Like it was great. Absolutely great.
I didn't know that. Where did you dock? Where'd you dock the boat?
Redwood City to start. So it's like midway up the peninsula. There's a beautiful marina called Bear Island. It was like you were in Italy. It was like glorious. There was like cool, nice apartments around. If you went outside of it, it'd be like complete mud flats. And it was in sort of like on the inner peninsula, and so the weather was always glorious. Like it wasn't up in San Francisco. Yeah, so like when I first got there, I bought a boat. I bought like a 43-foot monohull sailboat. I like did a few sort of like tests taking out the Golden Gate and like going up and down the coasts. Like I went around the Farallon Islands like once. I went down to Santa Cruz, all the way down to LA once as well.
By
Yeah, and
yourself or
then
with friends or?
the Farallon Islands I did it by myself once. I did another time I went out there with friends and tried anchoring at the Farallon Islands because I looked on like some Google reviews and someone was like, oh yeah, there's an anchorage there. There's no anchorage there. So we just tried to anchor in like the worst possible place. And if you don't know, like Farallon Islands is like the great white shark capital of the world. And like we woke
Oh,
up and the boat was like almost being smashed on rocks by the seas that had picked up overnight. And so it was a spicy story for a different time. But
it also smells bad there, right? Because of all the bird
yeah,
droppings.
all learning experiences. And then like I kind of realized through the course of the first like year and a half, having this monohull sailboat that like I really wanted to go sail over the horizon and sail around the world. And I realized as well that monohull sailboat was like not the right boat to do that on. Good for being like a apartment in San Francisco, but like not necessarily the right product for going around the world on. Then I ended up finding the exact boat I wanted in Tahiti, and so we just shipped the first Apple Watch in 2015, and I basically had not taken any vacation for like the last like year and a half or something like that because like I ain't got time for that. And so I had the full 6 weeks of vacation left, which just so happens to be enough vacation to get from Tahiti to San Francisco on the boat I was buying with no margin. Like, like literally like you stop at a new anchorage like somewhere and you like pick up fuel and you go. Like there's no dilly-dallying. So I left bought this catamaran that's actually in New Zealand now, and went down there with three friends, picked up this boat. Yeah, we left, all kinds of stuff broke, like on the equator, they actually had the mainsail fully tear in half. And if you look at the wind routes around the world, going from French Polynesia to Hawaii, you need to actually go upwind quite a bit. And so without the mainsail, we were like not able to do that. So like it was like, well, where are we gonna go? The Philippines, And we hadn't really checked all of the repair kits on board, so we got lucky that we found four sewing needles and some thread. And so we spent 3 days awake continuously sewing the sail back together on the deck of the boat, which is actually really fun. Like being there, four friends just passing needle back and forth through the sail. We broke three out of the four sewing needles in the process. We had one left. It happened to be the biggest one though, so like we progressed from smallest needle, which was easiest to get through the sail, to the biggest needle. Biggest needle was the last one that was left.
Wow.
And got it going, got to Hawaii, and then kept going to San Francisco. And that was a super cool experience.
And did you make it in time?
Wow.
Were you there on Monday morning?
Yeah, I got into San Francisco on Friday, and my vacation was up on Monday. So
Wow.
Pretty good.
but super fun. It's one of the best experiences of my life. Those adventures where you don't think too hard about it. You're just like, yeah, there's some key goals that we're going to go do. But like, if we get into all the details of the planning, then we might not go do it because we get bogged down with overthinking it. I was part of the second Apple Watch, the third Apple Watch, the fourth Apple Watch. Yeah, at some point it was just, time to go sailing, because that was like my dream to go do for a little bit. And so left, sailed across the Pacific for, yeah, effectively a year and a half. So did Alaska, Mexico, French Polynesia, Tonga, and then down to here.
You
And
sailed to Alaska.
yeah, Alaska's great. We had the boat like among glaciers, like in icebergs. Like, I caught so much
Wow.
salmon, so many Dungeness crabs. Alaska's actually one of my favorite places to go sail. It's oftentimes true that like the places that are off the beaten path sailing wise sometimes are the best. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's true in the South Pacific. The islands that are less frequently visited oftentimes are the best islands you can go to. And Alaska is definitely infrequently visited as well because it's hard, but like it's also worthwhile.
Did you ever get in like
Yeah.
dangerous situations sailing across the Pacific?
Yeah, we were a quarter sunk one time. So like this has not even gotten in, we're 40 minutes in. We haven't even gotten to Vessev yet.
We'll get there.
But yeah, it was quarter sunk one time. Yeah, we calamity of failures, but like we left to go sail across the Sea of Cortez on Christmas. And there's like a few different previous failures that had happened where we didn't fully have confidence in the rudder on one side of the boat. And so we left a emergency rudder system in just in case we needed it. But to add that emergency system in required a hole being open on the deck to actually access the rudder post. And so, but like it's like, a half meter above the waterline. So like I thought it was fine. And the seas on this trip ended up being quite confused. Like we had wind coming from one direction, then it was coming from a different direction, and that creates kind of wild seas. And what was happening was some of the waves are getting over the top of this rudder post and filling this hole, which normally
Um,
would be a problem because you have things called bilge pumps, which pump the water out. Well, it also so happens that the bilge pump on the side of the boat decided that this was the day that it was going to take off. Normally, like, so the beautiful thing about like my boat over here is it's designed to be partially sunken if it's filling from the bottom. So the whole hull is segmented in different parts where if you, pardon the expression, it's kind of like the Titanic where it has compartments and if you don't breach enough of them, you're still going to float. Well, in this case, water was filling from the top because the waves were coming over the side. At like 2 a.m., I realized the boat was behaving strangely. It was going really slow and like quite sluggish. And I open up the door and look astern at middle of the night, and I just like wash a wave, just like wash over the back of the boat. I'm like, that should be dry. Like, what's going on over here? So go back to like the back corner of the boat, which is like where the engine is, and I open up the locker that's like top down looking at the engine, and I'm looking through a foot of salt water at the engine. I'm like,
oh my God.
that's not right.
Jesus.
Yeah, well, my partner at the time goes and checks the other side of it, and there's like cartoons where it's like you're in a submarine and it's leaking, and there's like little pinholes and like water's peeing out. Well, it was doing that into like the bunk, so
Oh,
like
wow.
water was like getting past that to the next compartment,
Oh my God.
and then figured out what was going on, how the water was getting in, plugged it up with a towel, and proceeded to spend like 3 hours with a bucket. The fastest bilge pump in the world is a sailor with a bucket. So proceeded to dump the water out, get the engine dry again. Found every can of WD-40 I could on board. doused the engine in fresh water, WD-40'd it, tried to preserve as much as I could. Ended up sailing. We weren't able to like sail to the destination we wanted to because of like all the stuff that was happening. So we ended up completely on a different side of the Sea of Cortez.
Wow.
And in some random port, ended up looking up articles on like how to preserve engines that had been in sort of like hurricane flooding in terms of like, pickling them with diesel. Yeah, I'm pleased to say that that engine lasted another 5 years. So like, yeah, like after my preservation efforts, it lasted another 5 years. And it was only last year that it decided to finally cease to operate anymore.
That's a good engine. And so,
Impressive.
so you sailed around the world, you saw all kinds of places, and then you decided New Zealand is the place to settle.
Well, I got here right before COVID. So I'm
Right.
like technically a COVID immigrant. So I got here in 2019. I was scheduled to go back up the Pacific to continue on around the world and had crew that were flying in from different parts of the world in, March and April of 2020. But air travel was being shut down. The South Pacific was progressively closing. And so like those options kind of disappeared. And so I found myself like in New Zealand, for those initial lockdowns. Yeah, like for the time period, like it was one of the best places in the world to be because like after New Zealand had eliminated it. We had all the freedom for a while. Proceeded to sail around New Zealand for a little bit. So sailed all the way around down to Stewart Island, down to Fiordland. One of the things I didn't know about New Zealand before I got here was that there actually is a technology scene here. I didn't know that working in Silicon Valley. And there's a technology scene here for some of the same reasons that there is one in Silicon Valley. It's like you have this collection of people who in some ways can trace their roots to, being on a frontiersland land and having to make do with less. And, that self-selects for ambitious and risk-taking people who are also quite clever and ingenious with how they use resources. And New Zealand is 100% that. And so then I looked around and said, oh, there's actually technology going on here, and decided probably, actually do want to stay here. I actually really love it. And it's cool that I can do that by joining a technology company and contributing in that way.
Did you set out to look for any tech company, or were you like, I'm going to do one that does something with boats?
It so happened that I was just getting into like the sport version of foiling, so like wing foiling. And so when I like walked into the, freight fish and sea change office, I was already like, oh, I'm very interested in this because like it's what I enjoy doing anyways. And it was a good combination of kind of the different things that, I'd come to love, sustainability, technology, and marine. So yeah, it was clear, that this was something that I wanted to do.
So maybe it was a good time to talk about foiling. What is foiling? You said you got into it personally.
I think the first foiling boat technically was launched in 1906,
So
but
the
it's
full name is
effectively,
hydrofoiling, right? That's the full name?
yep. Yeah,
Mhm.
yep. So like, the recent incarnation that most of the world has seen at this point is everything from sport, where sailboats now sail 3 times faster than the wind. And that's because they have substantially lower drag because of hydrofoils. A lot of drag from boats has to do with wave creation and surface area. And hydrofoiling, by removing boats from the water and flying on relatively small wings, practically eliminates wave creation and substantially reduces the amount of surface area that's in contact with the water. And so it results in an efficiency increase that is, between 500 and 300%, which
Mhm.
is enormous magnitude of an efficiency increase for any technology. Like if you look at the automotive space or aviation and said, okay, like someone's come out with a technology to make cars and planes 3 to 5 times more efficient, it would be the standard because you
Mhm.
can't ignore that. So that's what, it kind of is. And, my belief is that, this is going to be a fundamental technology in the sustainable marine future that we all want, just because you can't really ignore an efficiency increase of that magnitude.
So basically what it is there's a wing, right? This is like a horizontal
Yep.
wing underneath a boat or a surfboard or something. And whenever you go fast enough, it lifts the whole thing out of the water, right?
And the images that you have up are like solid wings. They've got no control surfaces. The
Hmm.
difference for you is our wings actually have small control surfaces on them that self-stabilize. And so
Hmm.
they fly like around through the water where they're making constant micro adjustments to keep the boat at a certain altitude.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we
here's
see
an
the boat.
example.
Yeah.
This is a good one.
Yeah, heaps of them.
So when you're saying you have the micro adjustments, you mean like the wings, so that horizontal plank on the bottom, that's a wing, and that can move sort of in this direction, right?
Yeah. We have high precision flaps on the bottom of our wings that actually, yeah, it's basically we run the boats the same way the America's Cup teams
Oh,
actually run
this
their
this here,
boats.
right?
Yep, that's a good graphic. So you
Hmm.
got little flap in the water and constantly making micro adjustments. And they do
Hmm.
that in response to things like weight, how heavy is the boat, where's the weight, the center of gravity, how much wind the boat is encountering and any kind of interaction with the waves that it's experiencing.
Got it. So basically, you were interested in this tech, you were using it yourself, you were hydrofoiling on your own personal kind of time, and then you learned about this company. At the time it was called Freightfish, right? Yeah. Tell us about that
Yeah.
early days of Freightfish and later Sea Change.
Yeah, I mean, so like learned about that and joined the company when it was up in Whangarei or Ruakaka, which, it's a smaller town than Auckland, up north. Yeah, when I joined the company, like we were simulating 24-meter boats that were crossing the Cook Strait, taking on 6-meter waves, and yeah, it was incredibly ambitious, which was really cool to see. And I was really impressed by the folks that we're working with here, Sam Harding, Gary, Max, Adam as well. Yeah, it felt like a smart group of people working on a cool problem, and so how could I really say no?
And that was at that point, that was all simulations. There was no boat yet to test.
There's two prototypes. There's one called Beerfish, which was designed to transport 96 beers across the Whangarei estuary. And there was another prototype called SB 2.9, but they're not manned. They weren't ones you could ride on. They
Mhm.
were effectively proof of concepts to develop the engineering team, develop the tools that allow us to build larger vessels at a greatly reduced risk.
So what was the bigger kind of like context for why this company at the time got started and should have existed? I mean, boats have been around forever. I've taken ferries, I've taken sailboats. The foiling stuff looks cool, but like what was the sort of, I guess, business explanation for why this company should have been a thing at that time?
Foiling is this like key technology for the future. There's 33 million boats in the world, and this is the most performant and sustainable way to move on the water. And so, like over time, I believe that a meaningful portion of these boats will also adopt this technology. The previous incarnations of the company were tackling different segments of marine. The first incarnation was tackling freight. The next incarnation was tackling car ferries. Those are applications that may have hydrofoiling applied to them in the future. But in terms of designing a strategy to start a business, there are also some of the most challenging areas to start a business in because, it was the largest piece of CapEx, great risk, bigger customers, bigger ticket items. And so big thing that we did as a team after I joined was like we changed the company to focus on different applications. One of the key things that we did with the Apple Watch was like really focus on who our key users are and like what they really care about, what's their killer app, what's their reason, what's their why, and who are they? And so, like when I joined the company, they made a big list of different personas in the marine space. Pretty much anyone I could think of that like operates a boat and kind of identified what is the opportunity, like how many of these are there? And what are the reasons for why? If we assume that some of these vessels are going to be hydrofoiling in the future, how big are these different customers' incentives? What really jumped out to me is when you looked at this list, like passenger vessels, like ferries and tourism operators, had by far the strongest whys that I saw. They have incredibly high fuel use. If you think about a ferry operator, they'll turn their boat on at 5 a.m., they'll turn it off at 10 p.m. They will literally run it all day long, use a heap of fuel in the process doing high-speed transits to different places. If you think about a tourism operator, they're using their boats a little bit less because like their hours are a little bit shorter, but they're still going long distances and they also are valuing sustainable experiences as well. Yeah, then these are also customers that are focused on passenger comfort, making their customers more comfortable on different journeys. Seasickness is a thing, depending on the size of the boat and the seas, you can actually encounter that in relatively small vessels. And so by removing the boat from the water and having these active control foils, we can substantially reduce the amount of motion that boats experience. So that's another clear reason. And then the third one there is
So it's
just
like driving, my experience from being on a vessel boat, it's like driving a car, but just on water. That's
yeah, I mean, like one of the like analogies they'll say it's like it's as if we introduced like rubber tires and active suspension to cars. Like you could have cars like rigid wheels without suspension and your ride would suffer as a result of that. Then the third reason is just like push for sustainability. Like within the sustainable energy space, there's really two types of energy. There's the really heavy kind, which are batteries, which are really attractive because they're so sustainable in terms of the amount of energy coming in and going out. And then you've got everything else, which is also attractive because it's got higher energy density. I'm talking about hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives in that vein. But the reality is that all of these alternative fuels are actually quite expensive when compared to fossil fuels, which are commoditized energy source that we find in the ground effectively, that's run through an incredibly commoditized supply chain. And the environmental impact is actually not priced into the cost of these fuels. And no matter what, whether you're using the really heavy kind or the expensive energy dense kind, you want to use a lot less of it because And this side, it makes you go further. It makes you charge faster with battery electric. And on this side, it reduces your OpEx for using otherwise expensive fuels. And it makes them more sustainable as well, where you consider the production to energy delivered efficiency of these different fuel types.
Interesting. So the company, I guess you're saying, kind of explored different markets. You came in as I think, product manager, over time transitioned to be the CEO, and you're still
Yeah,
working with the founder.
I came in as a effectively program manager. Same thing I did at Apple, cat herding, mole whacking, which I really enjoy. And I ended up spending a lot of weekends working in product management. So there's like some like over 100 slide long slide decks that I made just with like thoughts and notes and like different sort of like feelings on this space. And those slide decks were like, things I used to discuss with the team, like, hey, what tack should we be taking in this?
No pun
And I think,
intended.
yeah. Yeah, and I think like, one of the, yeah, like someone told me, yeah, if you look at like what your actual job is of the CEO, it's like actually only three things. It's A, making sure the money never runs out. It's very important. Making sure that you've got the right people in the right seats for the job. But the third one over here is vision. Where are we going and why are we going there? And being the champion of that. And so these like product management slide decks I ended up creating ended up slotting into this like vision category of being like, hey, here's like a tack that we can take and here's why we can take it. Max is an incredibly talented engineer. He actually wasn't working on the tech at all when I joined the company, which like was a total misuse of resources because the dude's absolutely brilliant. So now, he's working on a lot of the tech and the direction that we're taking there, which is like, been like a really effective change for both of us.
The company went through kind of a tough time, and that's kind of the time that you had to reduce the team, raised a smaller round than you had anticipated. That's when the investors, along with you, I guess you guys all decided it'd be great for you to be the CEO. And it was at that time that you had, I believe, we were an investor from the beginning, but we actually didn't invest in that round. We were frankly like, we thought it was the end of the company, to be honest, right? We thought, man, like this is,
I love
and
that though. I love the like the rock bottom expectations and just like exceeding that. Um,
right. You had a year, right? You had a year on like a skeleton crew. And yeah, I guess rock bottom expectations. What did you kind of like, how did you think about that?
well, like when I started sort of into like my new role, it's like ask yourself like what are the things that you have and what are the things that you don't have? And like the things that we had when I stepped in the role were you had a great team, like a really talented team that I'd worked with and I'd known that they were like smart and very capable. We just signed a deal with Fullers 360
That's the
and
biggest kind of ferry operator in New Zealand, right?
largest ferry operator in New Zealand. And honestly, they're a great partner. Yeah, super supportive to this day. As of right now, it's still the world's best partnership in our space in the world. Just because they're one of the few ferry companies in the world that like are taking serious steps towards their net zero goals. So Fuller's has a net zero by 2040 goal, and they're actioning it.
Mhm.
Yeah, they've got multiple electric vessels in build today. They're making the innovative leaps to take their company into the future effectively. So I had really smart team. Uh, really great sort of like customer attraction with Philips 360. And we had this incredible space that like kind of know is just going to be a big thing. It's, as I said, there's nothing you do to a car or plane to make it 3 to 5 times more efficient. And so like in a sustainable marine future, how does this technology not have a big role to play in this great transition? Well, we didn't
Mhm.
have as money, but like that's like a solvable problem. It's going to take time and it's going to be hard, but we had these other things. So yeah, it was like motivating rather than demotivating.
And so what was your kind of like, what was your goal? You were like, I got a year or so. What do I need to do to kind of to bring, because it's such an ambitious vision. Like, I think the bigger vision, I think what really excited me whenever you were talking about this is like, you see waterways as, like, you talk about this all the time, where waterways historically have been the transportation, kind of like the primary transportation mode for humanity, for humans, right? Before we invented cars and roads. And now we've sort of forgotten about waterways. And now you see hydrofoiling as a way of actually bringing that back because all the reasons you described, right?
Yeah, our
So how do you go into that ambitious vision with like kind of this limited resources that you had?
yeah, I mean, like one step at a time. In some ways, like limited resources are a blessing.
Why? Because they cut off your options. You don't have that much to choose from.
No, you don't get to explore every growth opportunity that you could take. Like, we didn't file patents for things that we would have, preferred to file patents for, as an example. You do have a limited set of options that you can actually go do. And for this last, we raised 3.3 million New Zealand in July of 2023, and that's pretty much everything that we had to actually put our first product in the water, as well as like build the foundations for the company of what it is today. And if you look at like hardware standards for like what we're trying to do, that is peanuts. That's nothing for like putting a world's first product on the water.
What was your,
Expected
for comparison, what were your like budgets like at Apple? They're probably like orders of magnitude larger, many orders of magnitude larger.
like that, yeah, technically it'd be confidential information, but like hundreds of millions of dollars, like
Right.
easily, what's flowing through the engineering side, not even like all the other operations teams. It was pretty easy to see what we need to do. Need to like deliver quality product. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. Yeah, luckily, like we really smashed that goal. We put the boat in the water on a Friday. We did a few dockside tests, that weekend. And then on Monday, we went and flew it for the first time. First time that we actually like attempted to go fly it. Yeah, it was like really successful as a team. That Tuesday, we had Fuller 360's executive team out on the boat,
Hmm.
which is effectively the third time that we'd actually taken it out.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was like, really heartening to like see it all sort of come together. Yeah, that video's got like a few different sections. Really heartening to see it all come together into what it is. And yeah, now we've just relaunched the vessel as well with the full cabin top and
Hmm.
on, which is like a totally different experience from what it was before. We've just put it through Maritime New Zealand certification. There's a few things that I's dot T's across that we're actioning right now, but we're on track to have that. And Full 360 anticipates running commercial service this year.
This
Yes.
year.
Yep.
Wow. That's
And that part
impressive.
of the video is when you first launched it, right? When you the first day on the boat.
That would have been a couple weeks after. There's another video that I've got from like the very first. Oh yeah, that transition in the middle of the video there is from the very first flight.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's
not
quite
that part.
impressive.
That part, professional drone operator. Therefore,
And
the
and now, Eric, maybe you can put this into some context. I mean, yeah, we're seeing a boat flying above the water, basically. In the context of like technology of other companies, there's a few other companies doing similar stuff. There's, I guess Team New Zealand and the America's Cup, they use hydrofoiling. But like in the broader context, for somebody who doesn't know much about this, how impressive was that feat of going from you had some prototypes to putting this boat that could carry 12, 15 people, putting that on the water and having it actually fly.
I'll put it in like perspective. Like, so there's 33 million boats in the world today. There's 107 electric hydrofoiling boats in the world today. There's a handful of them that are actually commercial, and there's two of them in the world that will be taking paying passengers this year. So it's
Only two.
like,
Only two.
yeah. And
Wow.
but like about 10 years from now, every single body of water you look out on is going to have vessels of this type taking paying passengers. So like we're at this like very early beginning of this like huge transition, which is quite cool.
That's incredible.
And so
Ye-
what's next for you in the next 12 to 24 months? So you've got this boat out, you raised a lot of money. What's going to happen in the next year or two?
Did
Yeah,
the money problem get solved after you put the boat in the water?
yeah, I mean, like your ambition scales up, but that's like same thing. You just have to be thoughtful with what you're resourcing and to create what we're doing. Luckily, we've got a great set of investors, including you guys, to support that vision. But yeah, like multi-pronged. So like before, our focus was pretty clear: put the first VS9 in the water, deliver a quality product, and build the foundation for a generational company. We have like a goals list for 2026 now. Rather than 3 items, it's like 15. Yeah, it's like obviously a bit more ambitious. A few things that we're doing in support of that are going to be building 12 of these 9 meters next year. So 12 VS9s. Some of those are going to international markets. Some of those are staying locally here in New Zealand. And then we're scaling up. Like we're going to be making much larger versions of these craft as well. It's like approximately 100 passenger, 18-meter foiling vessels that, will start rather than delivering sort of like bespoke on-demand experiences, those will start, being more of the, classic ferry and transportation. That's something that, I think hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people will experience. Like we put 100-passenger Vessev product in the water, and there's a city worth of people that will ride that product in its lifetime. It is quite a cool thing to think about.
It's exciting. And what do you think is the biggest challenge to make that vision a reality? I mean, obviously, like scaling up the supply chain might be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, so like the reality is that like building one of something is actually quite easy, because you can
Yeah.
adjust and you kind of like, you really need to like pay attention to like what the resources in, resources going out are. Building lots of something is significantly harder. significantly harder. That's what we're scaling up for as a company today. Our goal is to be a generational company operating in this space that, is going to have enduring value well into the future. They're taking steps that way in terms of like, how we're setting up a production facility here, how we're setting up our company to support that. Yeah, it's an exciting time.
I also want to ask, I think a really important question is you were a COVID refugee. I was a COVID refugee in New Zealand. And at some point, COVID ended and you had a choice, right? And like, company also has a choice to be based in New Zealand or not to be based in New Zealand. How do you see New Zealand as being as strategic? Is it important to be based here, right? There's obviously, you have the first customer here. But it's a small market, but maybe it's not maybe it's actually good for the kind of work you're doing. Like, how do you think about that and just New Zealand's kind of strategic value to the company?
If you look at like New Zealand overall, like if your family got here before the year 1940, before commercial aviation, you probably got here by boat, like maybe even like a sailing craft of some sort. And even when you look at sort of like the First Nations people of New Zealand, the Maori, they also obviously there's a rich maritime history there. And so like it's uniquely embedded into the cultural identity of New Zealand in terms of like marine. And so I joke that like everyone's aunt and uncle's a boat builder over here. And it's just like such key know-how and such key kind of like practical experience. Like everyone from the team is occasionally on the floor helping to support something. And that's just kind of different than the United States in terms of like how I think some companies over there run. And it's a little bit of why the United States is like not enormously large boat builder in the world. Yeah, there's a lot of advantages in being in New Zealand, technical skills as well as the knowledge that's just in country.
What's it been like? I mean, what about from talent perspective? Are you able to find and hire enough talent in New Zealand?
Yep. I would say the most challenging area that we have is electrical, sort of like marine type experience, mechanical engineering. There's a lot of that here. The reality is, I think the universities de-emphasize electrical engineering quite a lot, resource the same way that like mechatronics or mechanical engineering are. And so it's probably the area that we have most challenges in hiring. Yeah, with that being said, we are working on a very cool electrical project. And so like we have a lot of agency to attract key electrical talent to what we're doing.
I remember the other thing that you explained to me and that I think is really interesting, really cool is, I mean, New Zealand actually pioneered the team New Zealand or America, they pioneered hydrofoils and hydrofoiling, right? And so you've hired some of those folks, the folks who work on those, top boats. When the season's over, they have nothing to do. So a lot of them come and work for you. Is that another kind of hack and advantage that you have being based in New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, like there's an incredibly talented sort of boat building community here, and they kind of like rotate between different entities, including Team New Zealand, including Rocket Lab. And yeah, it's great that resource and that know-how lives here. I would say that New Zealand is probably the most talented country in composite manufacturing in the world.
What does that mean? What's composite like carbon fiber?
Carbon fiber, yeah.
Interesting. Why is that? Is that because of the boat building? Or?
Yeah, I think it's because of the history of Team New Zealand.
Cool. I think just to wrap up, I'd love to do like a quick questions, quick answer round, if that's okay. So yeah, top tips for founders in Australia and New Zealand who want to start a company.
I don't know. I don't have like a quick answer for you. I know, in taking over this role, I've done a lot of listening from a lot of folks because quite frankly, I don't know what the answer is to a lot of questions. And so I think staying humble and staying open to that feedback, probably one of the most important things. The exception being you kind of have to be super stubborn about your vision and making it happen, but everything around that, be quite flexible.
Sounds good. What is the best sailing destination in the world?
There's an island called Malpiha in the South Pacific. It's an atoll that is 3 kilometers in diameter, a ring of coral in the ocean. It's got one coral pass. It's about the width of a boat. There's constantly has like 4 or 8 knot current like flowing out of it. And there's 20 of the nicest people you've ever met in your life that live on that island. I was only planning to stay for 3 days. Ended up pulling in and we ended up staying for 3 weeks. Yeah, it's actually, I know this isn't a quick answer, but we ended up getting a reference from someone on an earlier island that, hey, my family lives on this island. Can you bring us some groceries? And so we like went to the grocery store, and these guys live like 200 miles away from the closest island. It is not close by any stretch of the imagination, in the middle of the South Pacific. And so you go there and we've got like bags of frozen goods and like other stuff. Yeah, they're just like the most friendly people ever. We show up there, they're making their own donuts out of like coconut milk. They've got like a beehive that like only feeds on like coconut flowers. Yeah, I just love that place so much.
What is it called?
Really amazing.
Mount Piha?
Malpiha.
Piha, Piha.
Maupihaa. Yep.
Cool. We'll check that out. And what do you miss most about living on a boat?
Dude, like waking up at anchor and having a coffee is like honestly one of the greatest experiences ever. Like just like waking up at the Bay of Islands, like making a coffee, it's just like so peaceful and so lovely because like the mornings are always so still.
No, great.
Cool,
We're
cool.
very excited for your next 5 to 10 years. And yeah, we're glad to be part of the journey. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to TechMates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with friends. We'll be back soon with more stories of Kiwi and Aussie founders reshaping the future and disrupting down under. Until next time, keep dreaming big and daring to disrupt.